All right, this is your Gaza War Sit Rep day 140. Hey, John.
Hey, Justin, thanks for having me.
So, John, we'll do the news roundup, and then I think we want to talk about the history of the siege, how the siege is eventually gonna have to be broken. Um,
Running
the
the blockade.
running the blockade. That phrase. Get used to that phrase. Get used to hearing that phrase.
Yeah, we're going to say it a lot today.
We're gonna say it a lot from now on, not just today.
We're going to speak
Um,
it into existence.
we're gonna manifest it. That's what we're gonna do. But first, speaking of manifesting, we were both, I don't know, we talked about this a little bit, but John and I were talking on the phone, and I was telling him how I was disappointed by Russia being stuck in this paradigm of the two-state solution and the false information about October 7th and terrorism, calling it a vicious terrorist attack and so on, and saying, in spite of all this, um, we still we can't excuse Israel. And Ali Abunimah tweeted he was very upset about that speech. And John, you said your expectations are generally lower than mine, so you were not as disappointed as me. Um,
About
but
states.
about states, exactly. But then yesterday I think we had the Chinese state give a speech to the the International Court of Justice on the Occupation, and they said the Palestinians have a legal and moral right to pursue armed resistance, and endorsement of this position should be uncontroversial and commonplace among
Yeah,
supporters.
and it is, right? It's the worst time right now, but it's also the best time right now. The resistance, the normalization of the resistance is something that I said earlier today. It's just something you can't put back in the tube.
So Russia is bringing Hamas and the Fatah and others to Moscow. I don't know if you know this, John.
No.
They're gonna try to get them to revive the PLO. They're hosting a
Oh,
conference to try to get the PLO going. But I mean, again, this is the big problem, as the more optimistic about states poll of this sit rep, the big problem with China and Russia is they are um, committed to the Palestinian Authority. They're committed to that legal framework, and they're committed to dealing with Mahmoud Abbas, and they don't feel like they can go around Mahmoud Abbas and deal with resistance factions or whatever. So as long as that's the case, and Abbas himself is committed to whatever it is Israel wants him to be committed to, uh, they've kind of taken themselves out. That said, Abbas does not exactly believe in armed resistance, so I don't know. I don't think when China says something like this, it's not empty words. They think very carefully about what they're gonna say. So I don't think this is gonna just be spoken out into the ether and nothing follow from it. I think there
have
will
have you been following in the conflict? I can't say that I've been following the statements. Like, has China made other statements? I don't recall.
China generally says two-state solution. China votes for the ceasefires. China freely transits the Bab el Mandeb.
Yeah,
Just comes and goes as they please.
yeah.
Just waves at Ansar Allah. Ansar Allah waves back. So there's stuff going on, and I mean with BRICS, like with Lula, with Brazil, expelling all diplomatic personnel from Israel, and I don't know. And then on the other hand, we have India selling drones and sending workers to Israel. So
Yes.
it's all very contradictory. But as far as China goes, I do think some it's not as bleak. It's not quite as bleak from my perspective as the rest.
Yeah, the Russian position, I mean, the Russian they couldn't speak to that position on Al Jazeera on the news, just basically just like the most generic interview after that statement, and they couldn't defend it. They couldn't
Yeah.
handle, a
Yeah.
mainstream media interaction on that, let alone like a seriously critical.
Yeah, I
uh
mean, Russia, you got to remember, Russia has like 1 or 2 million Russian Israeli joint, like dual citizens. Like, I think there's almost maybe as many or more Russians as there are American Israeli dual
mm.
citizens. And like, they have a powerful lobby. They have lots of Russian Israeli billionaires. So it's not going to be, it's not a, it's not a forum for the most advanced thinking on this question, let's say. Okay. We also have um, we have a great speech by the Ansar Allah leader, um, Malik Houthi, I guess.
Abdul Malik Al Houthi.
Abdel Malik Houthi. And he has a speech. I have some notes about it. Let me pull them up because that was the 22nd. We're on the night of the 23rd here. And so he's got, so what did he say? He said America has a military problem and admits it has not faced such a problem since World War II, which indicates the effectiveness of the Yemeni front. The British are harmed, foolish, and stupid for involving themselves in what does not concern them. I love these guys. I love their speeches. I love their sincerity, and they're anyway. Um, Instead of aggression against Yemen, it was supposed to stop the war crimes in Gaza. So reiterated the point they're constantly making, which is that this is in support of Gaza. You can't stop this unless you stop the aggression on Gaza. So he says American and British raids on Yemen were 278 so far. But the amazing thing, and I think it's relevant to our discussion tonight, is he said, we will provide protection for any ships carrying aid to the people of Gaza. And I think that's another one of those statements. I admit, I'm never able to separate my prediction. I'm not a good analyst in the sense that I'm not necessarily able to separate predictions from what I would like to see happen. But I do think that when the Houthis say we will provide protection for any ships carrying aid to the people of Gaza, it's a sign at least that this is on their minds as well. This running the blockade question that we are talking about tonight. He said they've trained 237,000 trainees as a popular army, and
And then he said so far.
so far.
Yeah. So this is an active expansion.
Yeah. um Popular stands, demonstrations.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the thing to say, right? Is that this position by the Yemeni armed forces and Ansar Allah is backed up by this massive popular support on the ground in
Yeah.
Yemen for this
Or
action.
yeah, like they want to do it and the people want them to do it, but like if they didn't want to do it, the people would be out there demonstrating and trying to make them do it. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's extraordinary. So that speech, I mean, we'll get back to it after. I want to talk headlines or like resistance summary a little bit. But when he said we will provide protection to anybody running the blockade, that's a big deal. The United States has arrested a Pakistani ship and claimed that they were sending weapons to the Houthis. I don't know if you saw this story, John.
No,
The Palavan, which I think means wrestler in Urdu or Persian. So the Palavan, and they're being charged with aiding and abetting the Houthis. And there's a quote here. I'm gonna actually show this. It's you're gonna love this, John. It's on there's a writer named John Helmer, not
What?
to be confused with John Elmer. John Helmer. John Helmer is this American writer. He kind of specializes on Russia affairs, and he on his site Dances with Bears, he says there's this quote: Palawan knew that the weaponry would be used by the Houthis against American or Israeli targets to compel the United States, among other things, to end its support for Israel or compel Israel to stop the war in Gaza. So that's, that can't be allowed to continue. So they've been apparently indicted in the United States District Court of Virginia, Eastern District of Virginia, against Mohammed Palawan, Mohammed Mazar, Gufranullah, and Izar Mohammed for they were captured in international waters trading with the Houthis. So
Right, which they weren't going to attack the Israeli. They're trying to end the
no,
blockade that's literally
yeah,
starving people to death.
yeah, yeah. And so and they're also, the bombing Yemen has had no effect on stopping Yemen. So now they're trying to attack third parties who are trading, like Pakistani sailors, Pakistani captains, who might be trading and claiming that they were trading with Ansar Allah. And who knows if they were? Who knows if this isn't all just cooked, maybe to try to get Pakistan to do something else that they're doing or whatever. Okay.
But states are allowed to sell weapons to each other. So this is just like
Right.
American exceptionalism like to the max, right? Like this the
Absolutely.
country that's airlifting literally two a day airlifts of weapons to the Israelis versus one ship coming into the sovereign state of Yemen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, this week, the Ansar Allah and Yemeni armed forces downed an MQ-9
Oh
Reaper
yeah.
drone, which is a cool $55 million.
55 million?
Yeah, I quoted it. I was quoting for people who are electronic intifada listeners. I was quoting I didn't do inflation. So I hadn't
Wow.
updated my brain on the fact that the previously $32 million drone is now a $55 million drone, according to the United States Air Force. And it's the second that the Pentagon has admitted to. And then there's a third downing that's happened that the Pentagon didn't confirm. But
And this is from a shoulder launched missile or some
no
truck
surface
launched?
to air missile, but
It's a truck.
apparently a indigenous surface to air missile. So something that they're presumably have more of. Um,
You get
yeah,
the
no, and they
sense.
got it on video. I was able to do a video breakdown of it because they caught it on video in the night, and
Wow.
it's incredible because they fire it and then they're just like praying as it goes up, just being like, come on, come on, come on, come on, and bam, the sky lights up and it falls out of the sky. This is just for people. This is like a hunter killer drone. It's like the drones that, of course, American drone warfare
It's a
started in
plane.
Yemen
It's a plane. It's a plane with
that
missiles.
doesn't land. Yeah.
Yeah.
That can stay up for a long time and fire missiles at weddings and funerals and all the various
And American citizens,
American citizens
children,
in Yemen.
American child American citizens.
Yeah. So
Uh, yeah.
and then they're constantly firing kamikaze drones. The U.S. said today that they shot out another something like 10 that they have to shoot out. 2 days ago, they had to shoot a dozen out of the air that are coming at U.S. warships. They're firing on U.S. warships. That's what they're talking about when the U.S. is saying that we haven't had this since World War II. They actually mean that hostile action at their like to be actually fired on consistently on their warships. Um,
And they have these advanced anti-missile systems.
yeah, so the
Probably the
warships
most
are
advanced. Yeah.
yeah
The most
the
advanced technology is on these warships,
yeah
but the ammunition is finite. And when you run out, you got to go somewhere and re up, reload, refit.
yeah Yeah,
And
it's very resource intensive, and essentially all of these, a lot of the boats that the Navy has are cruise missile destroyers. So, yeah, they're essentially floating anti-missile
yeah,
ships that are getting constantly hit by or
by
fired at
much
by.
cheaper. And they're doing it, they've done that already, eh? Like US groups, naval groups have come and gone and been kind of relieved by others. So this is an ongoing expense for
Yeah,
them.
a massive expense, no
And
question.
this is part of the strategy of both Ansarallah and Hezbollah in Lebanon and the resistance in Gaza, that they're expending anti-missile, they're continuously forcing the expenditure of anti-missile system ammunition.
Yeah, yeah,
And
constantly escalating,
yeah,
essentially constantly escalating, doing the opposite of being afraid of the threats that are
yeah,
coming,
undeterred, and
undeterred.
also, but like tactically, like sneaking in bigger missiles in between barrages of cheaper missiles. So that
Yeah,
happened, I think, today. Hezbollah, these Burkhans with the big payload. What's the payload, John? 500 kg, I think.
yeah, yeah, it's something like that. It's huge.
So the
I think it's
so
just as big as you want to pack them, more or less.
so in between these smaller rockets, Katyushas, etc., they fired two big Burkhans on Israeli military positions yesterday. Israel was also firing missiles into civilian areas in Lebanon.
Yeah, and there's been, yeah, hundreds of airstrikes on Yemen since the U.S. decided to start doing that.
Okay, so run the blockade. Oh no, Gaza. We have to talk about Gaza.
Yeah,
I'll go
gotcha.
to Aria's feed, because it's lots of fighting in Gaza City, lots of fighting in Khan Yunis. So
Yeah, they
uh,
reinvaded Gaza City, south of Gaza City, um,
Zaytun neighborhood.
Zaytun neighborhood. So that's been going on for the last few days. And this is the sort of idea that the Israelis are going to try to do is like set up in the buffer zone and then
Yeah,
carry out these targeted raids that are, instead of full city battles, they're going into clear areas that they said they already had absolute control over, but everybody, including all Israelis, know that they don't have that. So they
yeah,
went back in, and then immediately when they went back into Gaza City, all the resistance factions, which you can see here, all the resistance factions are filing
yeah, and they're
field
letting go.
reports.
Yeah.
So
Merkava tank, soldiers inside a house, two Merkava tanks, soldier forces in their vehicles, Merkava tank, Merkava tank with a tandem rocket, Merkava tank with an explosive device, military vehicle, APC, Merkava tank, and then shelling. And the shelling, I mean, this is a point you've been making for years, John, but the shelling gets more accurate as the war goes on.
yeah, yeah, no
It's
question.
not something you can practice in peacetime as well. So the
Yeah.
teams get better, and that's why I've seen more videos of mortar attacks where they show the aftermath of the mortar attacks as well, because they're clearly, like, it looks like the video on one side looks like someone with a tube, and he puts it in the tube and he covers his ears, and it's like, okay, looks like he's doing something. But then when you see the aftermath, those mortars are landing and they're doing serious damage.
Yeah, and those videos that you see, when you see the mortars landing, it just shows you that they have reconnaissance all over the city, that they're still operating, right? To just get that footage on camera, because what they get on camera is not everything, right? It's the
Yeah,
opposite. It's
exactly.
probably just a small window, but it gives you a sense of the reconnaissance of course, that the indigenous people have in their own cities.
Yeah,
And then there's been a couple of sniper videos
yes,
as well that were um, clearly at least significant casualties. And the Israelis reported casualties, interestingly, almost right away once they reinvaded Zaytun. There were casualties on the Israelis immediately admitted to 3 incidents on the first day of the invasion, which is something that
Not
they
normal for
haven't been
them.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the breakdown of I don't think we need to break down Netanyahu's latest plan, his day after plan, because it's not going to happen. And to me, it's just another fantasy. Just another fantasy. Like, oh yeah, we're going to reinvade, we're going to occupy, we're going to have indigenous uh, forces following our orders and re-educate people to like Israelis in this ghetto. What the only one interesting point to me, it's not that interesting, is that it's not a plan to expel everybody to Sinai. The plan is that people are in Gaza in this plan.
I mean, the plan is just such a bad plan. It's basically essentially the idea is that they'll get tribes and clans who are allied with them to be in control of the economy and the government. It's kind of like Israel's dream all
Yeah.
along. And this is how, for so long, Israel was able to sow discord within the Gaza Strip was by pitting these families against each other, causing chaos. And the Qassam brigades and Hamas have, since 2005, when the Israelis left, have set about correcting that as a counterintelligence operation, as a national liberation
Priority.
project.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a priority. And so it's like it's a plan that is 15, what year is it? 19 years uh out.
Obsolete.
Yeah, and it was obsolete at the time because Hamas took over Gaza, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't as soon as the day that the Qassam brigades decided enough is enough on the US backed coup. Um, they took Gaza in hours, basically. The only thing that held them back from doing it before was political decision to not start an intercommunal fight.
Yeah.
But once they decided to do it, they took control right away. So it's just such a it's not a serious plan, but I think it's more of a political thing because literally Netanyahu has no plan. And
But
like he goes into these meetings with no plan for the day after.
is there any interest in the from your perspective in the fact that it's no longer we're gonna send them all to Sinai? Or
I mean, I don't think that I personally believed that that was going to be a possible thing.
right.
I just don't that the it's just not a possible thing. The United Nations, the border, Egypt, um,
Yeah.
I just don't think they were going to let that happen. I think that there's definitely a question of whether people just burst through the wall to try to find safety. Um, but yeah, I didn't get too into that Sinai plan because
Right.
it,
For the
it
same
it also
reason I'm not.
it requires you to
Yeah.
win the war
Yeah.
and to have nobody to defend themselves. And that's just not the case. Like even if it was true that they were cleared from the north, Qassam, they're not from the south. So I don't think
Well,
that
and
was a serious plan.
that's an interesting point. Just two more points. One is on the humanitarian. We'll conclude with the humanitarian thing before we get into the siege history. But one last point. From a strategic perspective, I wondered if stepping up attacks in Gaza City and Khan Yunis is strategic in the sense of interrupting the planning for the Rafah invasion.
Well,
Like,
I think that there's an interim period that we're looking at that we talked about because in order to begin the invasion of Rafah, the Israelis are getting, I mean, it seems ridiculous to say, but they're getting pressure from the Americans to have a plan for not just massacring tens of thousands of people. Um, it does seem like that is a red line for the US. I mean, maybe they
Hmm.
seem to be saying that. And in any case, it's made the Israelis um, take this period of time. So they've identified the 3 weeks between now and Ramadan,
Yeah.
which is when people will all be home together in the West Bank, in praying in Jerusalem. It's a flashpoint time. Um, people are already with their families. It makes people's feistiness to, readiness to fight. I don't know. I don't know. When I first went to Palestine, people said, Ramadan, it's
It's
a
like
time of
Christmas.
peace.
Yeah.
And then somebody, you'd talk to somebody else and they'd say, it's Ramadan. It's a time for war. And so I'm not sure that there's like an
It's a
overarching, but
pretty
the
long,
reality is that they're
it's a
worried
pretty,
about
yeah.
Ramadan
Yeah.
blowing up in the West Bank and opening
Yeah.
up these multiple fronts.
Because they want to blow it up. At least a faction of them want to blow it up over the mosque at Ramadan.
Oh
Like
yeah, there's more
this,
than a faction, right? Like there's
yeah,
there's a huge element of the Israeli
yeah,
society and government right now that yeah, just wants to destroy everything. And that's why um I think that's why those TikToks are so popular, is that there
yeah.
really is an appetite to just destroy. And the question I think for Israel is like, how could they get the most latitude from the Americans to destroy the most? And I just don't think the pushing into the Sinai was a thing. It was push everybody to Rafah. But now attacking Rafah, there's so many civilians in Rafah right now, just to be strictly military
You need
analysis on
more
this.
men.
You
You
need
need
more
more men.
troops.
It would have been better to do it at the beginning when they had all those hundreds of thousands of
Yeah, so that's
men.
the other part of it is that Israel needs a break too. So it's not just that the Israelis are like waiting, and, oh, let's wait till we get the okay from the Americans. The
No, I don't.
Israelis are,
I don't think that at all. I don't think there's a red line from America at all. But I do think that there are operational considerations because they released pretty much all of their reserves back to
yeah, all of
civilian
them.
life.
There's no more reserves in Gaza.
They've
So
sent lots of their troops to the border with Lebanon.
yeah.
And so, the Air Force is always the Air Force. They're always bombing. They're always killing civilians.
Which is important to say for the audience that this, even though this is goes on consistently every
Yeah,
day, they're killing more than 100 people every single day. So when we're talking about an interim period, I just want to be clear that
yeah,
it's not an interim period for the people who live in Gaza. It's
yeah.
a crisis.
It's an
Um,
Air Force versus people in Gaza and ground troops against the hospitals, basically.
yeah.
Ground troops against hospitals, Air Force against civilians. But
Well,
to
hospitals, ground troops, the reason why they take the hospitals is because it's literally the only objective they can achieve. There's no other, it's not like they take the hospitals and they take uh the
right,
schools that people are in, or they
right,
take neighborhoods. That's not happening.
yeah,
They're dismantling the healthcare system as the target. That's each place that they've attacked, they've used the hospital as proof that they won the
did
war,
something.
right?
Yeah.
Like Jabalia, that was the same. Gaza City with Shifa Hospital. Um, yeah, these numbers are just unbelievable.
So this is updated, so we might as well show it today. It's day 140. Killed 38,066, according to them.
Yeah.
71,000 injured.
So this is Euromed.
14.
They have higher numbers
Yeah.
because they are less, they are using a criteria
Presumed.
that the hospital doesn't use. And the real fear is that these numbers are much more likely to be the
Yeah,
real
of
numbers,
course they are. Of
because
course they
this
are.
is this is Euromed taking people's names,
Yeah.
right? Like somebody saying all the 50 people in this building. If those 50 people don't show up at the hospital,
Yeah.
they're not being counted as dead right now.
Yeah.
And we just know that that's such a core part of the horror that's happening in Gaza right now is collapsing these buildings on top of entire extended families. And just the margin of error on the death toll is just, it's brutal.
So
So,
38,000 plus killed, 71,000 injured, 99,600 completely destroyed homes, 241,400 partially destroyed homes.
and
One,
partially destroyed is a meaningless term, right?
yeah,
Like if your wall is blown out of your
yeah,
apartment is not partially destroyed.
yeah. Your apartment is destroyed, and not 1,920 destroyed industrial facilities, and that, remember, includes all the bakeries, everything to do with food and food distribution.
It's every single hospital. It's not like they're saying, "Oh, this is a
Yeah,
hospital associated with a Hamas command center." Those are just the ones that the news covers. They're dismantling and have been since day one, dismantling the hospitals one by one. And so,
326 healthcare professionals killed, 430 injured. So, as part of the anti-hospital campaign, and 3,120 detainees are forcibly disappeared.
yeah, I mean, even that number seems low because they they don't know. Like, the Israelis are setting up a checkpoint, um, and filtering people through and just pulling everybody out. There's no way you can properly count that number. There's no human rights group that has the ability to count. So I bet that number is conservative as well. And then
So,
what is it like if you're detained for 36 hours or 48 hours and left outside naked, does that count?
I
Or are
think
these
it
the
means
people that
you're
are actually in the prison camps that the
no,
Israelis
I
have
think
set
it
up?
means you've been taken by the Israelis and not returned. So wherever you are and however long you've been there, you're a disappeared for detainee. Um,
And that number is in addition to 7,000 in the
yeah,
West Bank.
yeah.
So there is now 10,000 additional Palestinian prisoners. So what's that? Like 200% of the original October 7th prison number. And that's
Yeah.
it. That's what Israel's been doing is like partially they want to have pictures on TV of them shaking down people that look like they could be fighting age males, right? Like the part of it is that. But the other part is these are bargaining chips. They're torturing people and keeping them in these camps as bargaining chips to trade in a
Um,
prisoner exchange.
right. Uh, Yeah. The
It's
the the callousness towards their own prisoners was also not something. I mean, we knew about the Hannibal Doctrine, but we underestimated that. I underestimated that
Well, because
by a
it's
big
on the
margin.
verge of them saying, because the IDF is saying that the ground invasion of Rafah will last until May.
Mhm.
So the Israelis have given this deadline of Ramadan to say the prisoner exchange deal has to be negotiated by Ramadan or we're invading Rafah.
But what they're
So
offering is a pause. So it's not an exchange. They're saying, hand us over the prisoners and we'll pause the bombing.
yeah, that's not going to happen. So their people are going to be in, I mean, they could be in captivity for years. I wouldn't be surprised if they were in captivity for years. But right now you're talking about their planners are talking about just throwing an extra few months of their own people starving slowly. Uh,
Yeah.
and the only reason that their people haven't starved to death is because Palestinians look after their prisoners and feed them, as they always say, we eat what they eat what we eat, right? They all eat together. There's not uh, so I would imagine that the prisoners are doing better than almost anyone in Gaza. Like literally. It's but the Israelis don't care and they're
So, okay. So that's kind of like our sit rep part. But our deep dive of the day, we want to talk about the siege because the siege is the war issue right? I mean, the prisoners are the war issue, but the siege is the war issue. There's not This war is going to go on in some form while the siege of Gaza goes on. And the siege of Gaza has gone on since 2005. It's not a natural fact. It's not something that has to happen because of the geography of the region. It's just something the Israelis decided and have made normal in people's minds.
And in some
And
ways, this war today is a continuation of the war that started in 2005 when the Israelis left Gaza. There's been a number of, however you want to count it, 6 or 8 invasions of Gaza over this period of time that had no resolution. Each war, the resolution to the war was to end the blockade. That was always the number one
that
issue,
was the
end the
war
blockade.
aim. Yeah.
That's
That
the
was the
war aim. So Israel's, yeah, this is a continuation of siege warfare that began. Do you want to just do it? Should I start?
Yeah,
Should I
go
do it?
for it.
Okay. So it's important for people to remember back that this siege started because of a democratic election. The democratic election of a Hamas government, and people say the Hamas government in Gaza. It was not the Hamas government in Gaza. They won elections throughout Palestine. Jimmy Carter's group, called it the whatever his term was, basically the freest and fairest election that the Carter Center ever oversaw. Significant voter turnout, more than they've ever had in any of their other elections for the stooge governments that the Americans allowed them to have. Um, and so this is for people, for the boycott, divestment, sanctions idea. This is Israel and the international community sanctioning the Palestinians for electing a government. So these are the first ever sanctions against an occupied population that doesn't have its own economy. And it was devastating. It was devastating immediately. And I was looking before coming on the show because I was trying to find some of the great quotes from the old days of these talks, because I gave these talks back in 2005 right away, speaking about this, and right away the World Bank was putting out reports that said, this is the biggest economic collapse in modern history. They essentially just eliminated the Palestinian economy. They destroyed it by blockading Gaza and not letting anything in. Famously, Dov Weisglass, who was the advisor to Sharon, said that we're putting Gaza on a diet, that the international community won't accept starvation. So we're going to put them on a caloric
Yeah.
metric and divide it by the population and only allow that many calories through the border. They eliminated 90% of the industrial base in the Gaza Strip. And so basically they locked the place in a ghetto and they closed the door and threw away the key. And somehow that got normalized over all of this time, right? Like the Israelis say, oh, we had a ceasefire before October 7th, like October 6th. It's just not true. This is part of a continuous blockade that has defined an entire generation in the Gaza Strip. And just to say that this is a process that goes back, just to do it quickly, the first Intifada in 1987 leads to the beginning of the peace process. Israel's forced by the resistance, by Palestinian civil society into, what amounted to secret negotiations, because the public negotiations that began the process were rejected by Palestinians. And so the Oslo process that becomes famous is a secret process because the Palestinian population can't find out that Mahmoud Abbas is negotiating in smoky back rooms in Oslo to give away these crucial elements of the conflict, which the Oslo process didn't address: the refugees, the borders, Jerusalem, left all the biggest issues open. And so Israel, right away in the First Intifada, begins the process of locking Gaza up. Because previously, the Gaza envelope that we've talked about on this show a number of times, it functioned without a wall. It was a civilian border around the Gaza Strip. Over the course of time, starting in the 80s, starting with the Intifada, Israel started like closing off with a wall what was being done by civilian installations. Okay, so that's how the two things get connected so much into October 7th that we've talked about a bunch of times on the show. Because previously, if Israel could divide the territory using settlements, that's what they did. The Gaza envelope connected to settlements that were inside the Gaza Strip that de facto cut up the territory. So you didn't need to have concrete walls. You had effective apartheid just by the way you build the infrastructure of your state. So that's what Israel was attempting to do from its founding.
But that's a good point, though, almost accidentally, that the wall isn't necessarily what the Zionists dreamed of.
No,
The wall, they wanted settlements. They didn't want to wall people in. They wanted, because that's kind of walling themselves into and limiting.
one settler that I hitchhiked with, he said, you don't build a wall through your salon. Like you don't build
Yeah,
a wall through your living room.
yeah.
When I used to live in Jenin, the only way to travel in the Second Intifada, the only way for me to get out of Jenin from the north after I got out of Jenin to get south, you take the settler roads, because
The orange plates.
that's the only way you can travel.
Yeah,
And so I would ride with these settlers, and you always had to like, try to balance your where you were coming from, and they're crazy, but they hitchhike all the time. So they pick up hitchhikers all the time because the other settlers hitchhike because they have their own
yeah,
roads for the most part. Anyways, he said, yeah, you don't build a wall through your salon. He was upset about 2003
yeah.
when Israel begins to build the wall.
So
Because the
there's a
idea
wall
was to
around Gaza
build,
and there's walls around individual communities in the West Bank. And there's kind
and
of
the
a wall.
idea was that Zionism sets up a colony here, it sets up a colony there, and then it connects them.
Yeah,
One settlers told me, like Lego, you
yeah,
build blocks, right? One
yeah,
day you take this piece of land, and then maybe it's 20 years from now that you
yeah.
take the next piece. But eventually you connect all of your territory contiguously. And in so doing, you divide the Palestinian areas by a proactive Israeli civilian installation.
But
Um,
there was a reward for Oslo, for Gaza, which was the Yasser Arafat International Airport.
yeah, well, there
There
was
was an airport in Gaza.
there was small rewards for Palestinians. They had nominal autonomy over certain areas. Their fighters were allowed to come back from abroad. They were allowed to build. At the time, the plan was for Israel to build them a national army that would police their own, would police the occupation. And the Palestinians justified it at that time by saying, we get to bring our guns back and our commanders back to Palestine. And so that's the balance that's how the Fatah guys justify what became this collaboration with the Israelis so deep that now we call them a subcontract. We have for 25 years called them subcontractors, right?
Yeah.
That there's no liberation trajectory to the Oslo process. It was a
Just
security process for Israel.
but I wanted to just make sure people know that the airport in Gaza was bombed in I think 2000 or so and never never used,
It was
essentially.
bombed in the at the beginning of the second intifada. The
Okay.
Israelis destroyed that. So then the second intifada, the Oslo process goes in between for the 90s. Then the second intifada breaks out. And as a result of the second intifada, that's when Israel says we have to build a wall around Palestinian areas, not around Israeli. This is not a border between Israel and Palestinian. This
No, it's
is
a prison.
borders around Palestinian communities. So the wall's not a straight line, it's around each community. And then everything that's in the area around the community becomes de facto Israeli, and they have a bunch of laws about fallow land. So they lock you in your ghetto. They don't let you come out and till your land, and then it becomes fallow, and it goes to
Settlers.
like yeah, like an absentee landlord type law that was used um, in the British Mandate. Um, so yeah, the Second Intifada's resistance leads to the building of the wall, and it also leads to the idea within Israel that they need to completely separate from the Palestinians, and that's when Ariel Sharon announces that they're going to withdraw from Gaza, and Sharon says, "We had a dream, like the Zionist dream was to take over all of Gaza," and he said the dream couldn't be implemented. I forget exactly what the numbers were, but something like 6,000 settlers lived in Gaza in 2005 when they withdrew. Amongst at that time, it was something like 1.5 million Palestinians. So the demographics didn't work. And so the Israelis start talking about apartheid in Israel. Israelis have talked about apartheid for decades. It was banned in Canada to talk about it on campuses, but the Israelis talked about it because it's a significant factor for their country. In 1967, when they took over the West Bank, they took over all of the Palestinians that lived there. And basically, in historic Palestine, the populations are about split evenly, with Palestinians with a significantly higher birth rate. So even in 1967, there's a whole segment of the Israeli population that isn't in support of the occupation of the West Bank because they don't want to have all of those people
Yeah.
within their Jewish state. So Ehud Olmert, who was the prime minister at the time, said it was maximum Jews, minimum Palestinians. We need to create basically a state where we have the most Jews and the minimum Palestinians. And the way that they're going to do that is by walling off the Gaza Strip and withdrawing from Gaza. And so when they Israelis leave Gaza in late 2005, that's what begins the process of resistance building that we have seen come to
Yeah.
fruition in this now 20 years later, because Palestinians had control of the territory. They were inside a ghetto, but they were in control of it. And so they used that space to build this resistance movement. But they also used the space to have a democratic election, which happened like 6 months after the Israelis withdrew. The Americans let the Palestinians have an election, and the Palestinians elected Hamas. They elected Hamas not in just the Gaza Strip, which is what the media now always says that Hamas was elected in Gaza. They were elected in Bethlehem, which is supposed to be a Christian, just as an example. But they were elected because their municipal level officials were deeply respected in the communities. And the Fatah collaborators with the Israeli occupation were not. But the Americans didn't know that was going to happen. Condoleezza Rice famously says in her autobiography that because they allowed the elections to happen, they assumed that Fatah
Yeah. It
would
was
win.
stitched up. Yeah.
So she talks about going that morning, wakes up in the morning of the election, and she's on the treadmill in her place,
Time to
and she sees on the ticker that somebody's saying Hamas is going to win the election, and she falls off the treadmill and like runs to the whatever her office to try to figure out what's going on. The Americans had no idea, even though Palestinians told people who was going to win the elections. And so that is what the blockade started with. It didn't start with resistance. It didn't start with some attack. There was no justification for the blockade at all, except that Hamas was deemed a terrorist group. And now you have all these layers that
Yeah,
made it
and then
illegal, essentially, for aid to come in, for diplomats to meet with the government. They weren't able to
yeah.
meet because of American laws. And so it was because of a democratic election that this siege began. And it was crippling, right? Like if we had had this show in 2006, um, with Tarek, he would have told us what the impact of the blockade had on the hospitals, the healthcare system in Gaza, like right away. It destroyed it. And the Palestinians learned to rebuild it over those years, learned how to live um, under the siege in various ways. We know about the resistance ways they learned to live under the siege, but they learned in governance ways. They lost their teachers because the salaries couldn't be paid for the teachers. So they lost a whole bunch of teachers. They lost a whole bunch of doctors. They lost this whole
Well,
government apparatus, essentially, that had to be built over again by
there was
Hamas.
an there was an organization that I think monitored the effects of the sanctions, or the things the list of things they were letting in and out, and the list of that Israelis were incredibly specific. Like, you couldn't
Yeah,
have
it
an
was like you could
eraser.
have shampoo but not
Yeah.
conditioner, and then because of that you couldn't have two-in-one shampoo and conditioner. It was absurd. So they're counting their calories on one hand and then cutting off everything else being able to be delivered in on the other hand. And that's what leads to the Tunnel app network. The Tunnel
Yeah.
network was essentially a commercial network for the
Mhm.
most part under the border with Egypt, that the tunnels were a part of the government. And Hamas started taxing those tunnels to generate revenue to pay for civic infrastructure. So the resistance takes on this whole governance
Yeah.
aspect that is the thing that is what like you're supposed to be. That's what international groups would tell you to do, to
Yeah,
demobilize the resistance and build a
focus on
civil,
good governance.
yeah,
Yeah,
on good governance. So they
good
did,
governance.
and they set about doing that under. So all of the accomplishments of the Gaza Strip over the last 2 decades were done under a purposeful attempt to destroy the
And
civilian government. And now they can say about October 7th that Hamas is a terrorist group or whatever. Hamas is the government in Gaza. That's the significance. That's why they have the ability, the support, the infrastructure,
yeah,
um, is because they built it.
and they're the army, like you've said on Electronic Intifada. It's basically a national army.
So Qassam is a
It's a
national
regular army.
army that
Yeah.
that hasn't been defeated as a national army. And even if that were to happen, they would operate as a guerrilla group when they're not even at that point. They still have a traditional order of battle.
So what all of this context is to explain that the economy of Gaza, what goes in and out of Gaza, is completely under control of Israel. Um, since Oslo, since 1967 in many ways, but they used that power since 2005 to basically say nothing gets in and out legitimately from
Including
Gaza,
humans, like
including humans.
for the most part, people with scholarships.
Yeah. So this is a war. I don't know what you call it. A cause of war. It is not a tolerable situation by human beings, and the war will go on while this happens. There's no there's no way that people can live under the utter and complete control of those who hate them. That's just that's just not that's not, the war is going to go on until the siege is broken. And I've said, I've done some careful studies of the Egyptian regime, and the Egyptian regime would have been an easy and obvious way to break the siege, in the sense of opening that border, just becoming a normal border for the people who live in Gaza, who could come and go as they please across the border, and goods could cross the border. But Egypt is going to do whatever Israel wants and the US wants. So that's not an option. But what I think the siege is going to be broken is, it's going to be broken by sea. And in previous wars, the idea of a Gaza Sea port and a sea lane has been a war aim of the Palestinian resistance. And
The number one war aim.
I just don't see, the war ending until that happens. And the Houthis are obviously thinking about this, and others have talked about this. I think Turkey threatened to do it and then didn't. Nothing came of it. And Turkey's not that different from Egypt in this respect. They make noises, but ultimately they are shipping all kinds of resources to Israel on a daily basis themselves.
Yeah, and the
Uh,
reason why Egypt is that is because of the Camp David peace agreement with Israel, which gives the Egyptian state its the bulk of its military.
Yeah, which is
Um,
interesting, because you know how you talked about inflation of the MQ-9 Reaper drone? Inflation has been eating away at the military aid that the US gives Egypt. Like
oh,
it's
is it a
it's
fixed number? Because
it's like 1 point something billion a
yeah,
year,
I
which is
believe
nothing now.
it's one of the it used to be number two. The number
Yeah,
one recipient of U.S. military aid was
Israel.
Israel, and number two was Egypt in order to keep them at peace
Yeah,
with Israel. So basically, both of the
yeah,
top two. I'm not
or
sure if that's
Israel.
still the
It's
case.
Yeah, I don't think it is. And Egypt, Egypt is an incredible economic and financial misery right now, and apparently the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is offering them all kinds of sweet terms for renewing their loan and rescuing them. And people are wondering what exactly the quid pro quo is on those. But the
So
but the
it's a structural
Yeah,
reason as that why Egypt can't open that
yeah,
border.
I've covered it on one of my solo sit reps. I talked about it quite a bit.
Okay.
But the sea question is a totally different question, and the arrival of Ansar Allah on the scene has made this whole situation more dynamic. Because yeah, because that, at the beginning of the war, I wrote an article where I said, I think the siege is going to end with an Iranian ship sailing into, because that's what the Iranians did, that in Venezuela, right? They did it in Venezuela, and it was a crazy moment. Like they had this oil tanker going, and they were like, "We're going," and America was like, "Don't you dare go," and they were like, "No, we're going," and then they went, and America didn't even do anything. And so I think at some point in the next months or years, they're gonna do the same thing. They're gonna say, we're coming," and do what you got to do. And I mean, the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, they've been preparing for that moment. I think, uh, they're not training these hundreds of thousands of soldiers for no reason. Like, there's a lot of things that are happening that are that the resistance is doing that I don't think are for show.
So because the land borders are controlled by Israel and Egypt, which is de facto Israel, the
Yeah,
seaport is the solution,
yeah,
the only solution
the only solution.
to bypass and to create. So the Palestinian seaport has also been a number one condition of
Yeah,
every war that's been fought in the last 15 years. Every escalation, um, when Gilad Shalit was captured, Originally, that was part of the deal. Often Israel says they're going to do it and then just don't. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, the seaport is the one way um, to break the blockade, and it seems like a doable thing. But we should give a little bit. Do you want to do the Mavi Marmara? Because this so
Yes.
in 2010, right in the like at that point, it had been the blockade had been on for three something years, and everybody knew at that time, 4 years,
Yeah.
everybody knew at that time that the blockade had to end, that people were that they had destroyed Gaza, they'd choked Gaza off, and so a
So what
Turkish
was it?
NGO.
Yeah, it was a Turkish NGO called Insani Yardım Vakfi, I guess. But it wasn't just them. There were lots of people from North America too, and Europe. You know, all the usual kinds of activist types were there doing their nonviolent activism. There were 6 ships, 10,000 tons of supplies. The bill footed mostly by Turkish, I guess, this Turkish organization. And Israel basically did a commando raid, like helicopters, a naval attack on this flotilla. They killed 6 people, I think.
10
Nine.
people
They killed 9 civilians. Um, and they, they
landed on the ship and disabled the ship.
yeah, they landed on the ship, disabled the ship, and they diverted the ship. They arrested everybody. And then
Right,
smearing all
diverted
the
it
stuff
to
that they're doing now. They talked about how they were terrorists and everything, and it's interesting because like Finkelstein had this book called like "This Time We've Gone Too Far" or something. He was quoting some Israeli where like 2010 and the Mavi Marmara and this attack on this flotilla was like, at that time it was seen as this appalling red line that Israel had crossed. And my God, here we are. But
well, the raid
they
was defined by failure, right? The raid
Yeah,
was defined by this Flotilla 13, these special forces that took the hospital and took the PLC, the Palestinian Legislative Council. These commandos rappelled down from a helicopter
and some of them
right
were,
into the arms of
yeah,
these unarmed protesters who defended themselves.
yeah,
And then the Israelis responded to that by massacring people on the ship um,
and
that the
extra
whole world was
legal
watching,
summary
right?
execution. Like they probably shot them like execution style. That's what the United Nations mission thought.
And the whole world knew that this ship was going, and we were wondering at the time if the ship was going to get in. So
Yeah.
that was an NGO ship that the Israelis were able to say that's a terror ship. And so what we're talking about today is
Well, in
nation
fact,
state doing it.
just to say, in fact, this caused a major, I don't know how real it was, but it was a diplomatic problem between Turkey and Israel. And the Turkish prime minister, I think, prime minister at the time, he said, we're going to send another one, and this time it's going to have the Turkish Navy. Like he made that threat, but he never did it. They patched it up somehow, whatever. They offered him something. And but that's where we need to get to. It's clear that like these unarmed uh nonviolent activist convoys or flotillas are just going to be treated as military targets by the Israelis. So it's going to have to be a state uh, that takes this on.
So
And
that's the background to running the blockade that we've been talking about for the last few months, is that it's got to be a state. Uh,
yeah,
and I think we identified which states it should be. I mean, you could see the Iranian ship getting sunk just straight up in Israel. But
yeah. I mean that
would
you're
the
right. Like
Chinese ship?
it could be a World War III scenario, but that's also China. China also doesn't want to get into World War III with America over this. So this is the issue is um I think they're waiting. I think everybody's waiting. I mean, I suspect it's going to be Iran, not China, but it could be like you're right that it could they could just face waves and waves of Israeli Air Force bombardment if they do that, and then they'll so if they come in force, it's going to be a naval battle, maybe a naval battle between Iran and America. I mean, you know, a lot of unthinkable stuff could start because of this, but
Yeah, is Israel's willing to start World War III. Israel and the US are willing to start World War III
the blockade
over starving
overstarving.
mostly children, which is Gaza's population is mostly children, slowly starving them to death.
Well, we don't. I mean, and again, this might be why the you know Ansar Allah might be the ones who try it, and suppose you know they send a ship and the Israelis sink that. You know, that's not going to start World War III, right? But it would.
It just would be so much easier if it was Indonesia and China, or and just fly white flags, get some kind of.
But what? But then, are they ready for? Are we ready for Israel to blow up a Chinese aid ship? Are we ready for that world? Because that's a weird world, man. That's not the world we live in today. After Israel does that,
Yeah, well, these maps that we show sometimes that show all of the American warships that are in the Red
mm,
Sea,
mm,
there's Chinese ships, like you said earlier in the show, doing their thing in that
yeah,
area, like apparently minding their own business. What
what are they
It's
doing?
not like they're not
Just
there and they would
monitoring.
have to start. Everybody's just watching this genocide. It's so unbelievable. Not to get into tanky group therapy on the sit reps, but I can't believe what we're watching. I can't believe these governments
With
sit
power to
in
do
these
something.
meetings with
Yeah,
power to do something and just don't do anything about the starving of children.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like this is
It
how
can't continue.
the ceasefires in previous wars, like 67 and 73, they also happened because the Soviet Union said we are willing to start World War III over this. And the Americans went to the Israelis and said, the
We're
Soviet
not.
Union is willing to start World War III over this. You've got however many hours to grab what you can, and then you have to stop. And nobody is willing. I mean, yeah. So we don't have that anymore in the world, and that's what's happening. What is this? Warships to coast of Syria? I don't know what I'm looking at. I'm trying to find one of these maps, but this is old stuff.
Well, it's just the map makers never put the Chinese ships on it.
Mm. Yeah, and Ansarallah also doesn't put the Chinese ships on there. They don't. They don't.
I
But
just think that
yeah,
the we're so deep into this crisis. Everybody in the world knows what's going on. It feels different than the Mavi Marmara. It
yeah.
feels beyond being able to say we sunk that uh yeah, naval vessel, not an NGO. I mean, you could be an NGO, it could be a United Nations flotilla.
Oh well, you know the Israelis would blow that up. I don't know. This is not representative, and I don't like the sight of this in the corner. I don't know what that means. But I'll just take that down. It's on Reddit. All right, John. Any last words
Run the blockade.
on the blockade?
I
Somebody's got to
think we
run
should,
this.
yeah.
What think we should
No,
do?
I think we covered it. I don't know if I went too much into the siege because we were going to do a separate show on the siege because the siege is just so comprehensively appalling, that it never feels like it feels like we have to remind people of the context that this all took place in, and the context that the Palestinians had put up with for years and years. Even the current leadership, Yahya Sinwar, began this process on a diplomatic track. He offered a diplomatic track to Israel before October 7th. October 7th comes as a response to the essentially to turning off the transponder of the Palestinians. Just like
Yeah.
turn it off. People forget about it. They
They'll
forget about the
disappear.
conflict. And
We'll
all that
destroy
while,
the mosque in good time.
yeah, but all the while the Israelis are building. So
Yeah.
all of these years that we've talked about this wall been built since 2004, the Israelis are building this whole time. Um, and so it's just less and less to be yeah. Israel's project continues. It actually escalates. The settlement project escalates with the Oslo peace process.
We'll come back and do a whole Oslo thing. Like I did a whole Syria thing, I did an Egypt thing, but we should do an Oslo and the how the how the Palestinian Authority works and why it works for Israel and why it's been so stable, so incredibly unshakable through this whole process.
And so the group that organized that, um, the full circle is that the Russians are trying to bring Hamas into the PLO, which they are not in. And then that's the line that the Russians are trying. So the conference that we began the show about is to bring Hamas into the PLO so that that group at least speaks for all Palestinians, which is something that whether it's the PLO or in some other formation that Sinwar has offered to reconcile and to bring that together, because the national project requires all parties to be part of whatever group. If we're calling it the PLO, then it needs to include Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and if it's some other formation, it needs to include all the groups because you can't have a, a peace process um, that doesn't include all the groups. I mean, that's just such an obvious thing to say.
Okay, we'll come back for the PLO and the PA another night. In the meantime, well, if you've reached the end, this has been an hour and a half or something, but definitely like and subscribe and do those things. And we'll see you in the next sit rep.
See you guys.